At some point in your life, you started to distrust yourself, not in a dramatic way, not like a major breakdown, but as a constant feeling that something always goes wrong just when things start to go right. You make an effort, you get organized, you promise yourself that this time it will be different, and then, almost without noticing, you create a delay, a conflict, a distraction, and then comes the guilt, the old guilt, the sense that you are your own obstacle. But maybe the story runs deeper than that. You're not failing, you're protecting yourself from something bigger. There's a part inside you that learned, long ago, that growing can be costly. Growing can mean losing people. It can mean being criticized. It can mean ceasing to belong. And your emotional system, which only wants to protect you, registers all of this as danger. Emotional neuroscience shows that the brain reacts to social threats with the same intensity as it does to physical threats. Rejection, exposure, change, all of these can trigger silent internal alarms. So you pull back, you procrastinate. You slow down, not because of incapacity, but because of self-protection. Self-sabotage doesn't come from incompetence. It comes from self-protection. Perhaps you learned early on that making mistakes was dangerous, that standing out was risky, that being too authentic could drive away love or recognition. So you developed clever strategies to survive. You became overly cautious, overly responsible, overly adaptable, and those strategies worked. They helped you get through difficult times. They kept connections alive. They built stability. The problem is that what once was salvation may now be turning into limitation. Many self-limiting decisions were once intelligent strategies in the past. Staying silent may have avoided conflicts you didn't have the strength to sustain. Not taking risks may have protected you from old humiliations. Choosing the safe path may have guaranteed stability when everything was uncertain. You weren't weak. You were being strategic. Only time passed, circumstances changed, and perhaps the strategy kept running even when it was no longer needed. The body still reacts as if the danger is the same. The mind still calculates losses that may no longer exist. The central conflict is simple and uncomfortable. Growing requires letting go of an old version of yourself, and abandoning that version can feel like betrayal. Betrayal of family, betrayal of your original environment, betrayal of the image others have of you. There is an invisible loyalty that binds you, a loyalty to the role you played for so many years. If you evolve, if you expand, something of that identity has to die, and no symbolic death feels comfortable, even when it's necessary. Friedrich Nietzsche spoke of the vital force that exists within every human being, a will to power that seeks expansion, creation, authenticity. He also warned that when this force is repressed by fear or excessive morality, it doesn't disappear. It turns against the person themselves. The energy that should propel you begins to erode you. It becomes harsh self-criticism. It becomes chronic procrastination. It becomes choices that shrink your reach, not because you want to destroy yourself, but because the force that finds no outlet ends up turning into internal tension. You may recognize this feeling in your body, a slight tightness in the chest when you think about taking a bigger step, a coldness in the stomach when you imagine being truly seen, a restlessness that arises when something starts to prosper, as if success triggered an alert, as if expansion brought along the fear of losing something essential. Because evolving isn't just about gaining, it's also about leaving things behind, and leaving things behind can mean losing belonging, predictability, identity. So the question few people ask honestly arises, what do you fear losing if you truly evolve? Maybe it's approval. Maybe it's the sense of control. Maybe it's the image of the strong person who never fails. Maybe it's the safe place where you already know who you are. Growing displaces. Growing reorganizes. Growing exposes. And if a part of you still associates exposure with danger, self-sabotage steps in as an invisible bodyguard. You may have spent years believing the problem was lack of discipline, lack of focus, lack of courage, but perhaps what's happening is more subtle. Perhaps there's a part of you still trying to survive a past that has already ended, and as long as that part isn't understood, it will keep interfering in your decisions, not out of malice, not out of weakness, but out of loyalty to what once ensured your safety. This is not an invitation to blame yourself, it's an invitation to understand, because when you understand the pattern, something inside begins to reorganize. Guilt, loses strength, clarity gains space, and you start to realize that you're not fighting against yourself. You're trying to protect something vulnerable within you. And when that vulnerability is seen with maturity and compassion, it no longer needs to sabotage your growth. Perhaps this is the moment to look inward with less judgment and more lucidity, to recognize that self-sabotage is not an enemy, but a signal that there is a part of you afraid of its own expansion. And when you begin to listen to that fear calmly, without running away and without attacking yourself, something transforms, not in an explosive way, but in a deep way, because all real change begins with awareness, and awareness is light, and light, even if it stings at first, always reveals paths that were hidden in the shadows, and when that possibility arises, even if it's small, it already starts to reorganize something inside you, because the pattern stops being fate and becomes an unconscious choice, and an unconscious choice can become a conscious one. That's the turning point. It's not an explosion. It's not a dramatic revolution. It's a moment of silent lucidity in which you realize, I'm not sabotaging myself because I'm incapable. I'm sabotaging myself because on some level I'm still afraid. Afraid of losing, afraid of changing, afraid of sustaining something bigger than what you've grown accustomed to living. There is a part of you that wants more life, more presence, more truth, and there is another part that fears the price of that expansion, because every evolution displaces old structures. Growing can mean saying no where you've always said yes. It can mean disappointing expectations. It can mean taking on a responsibility you've avoided for years. And taking on responsibility is frightening, because responsibility expands your consciousness. And when consciousness expands, there's no going back to the previous innocence. Perhaps you've spent a long time believing the problem was discipline, that you just needed to try harder, that you just needed to try again. But effort without understanding generates exhaustion. Force without awareness generates tension. And constant tension turns into wear and tear. The body feels it. The mind feels it. The soul feels it. That sensation of living on autopilot, of completing tasks, of keeping everything running on the outside while inside there's a light, persistent, hard to explain emptiness. That emptiness isn't a lack of capacity, it's a lack of alignment. It's the distance between who you are today and who you know you could be. And that distance hurts. It hurts in a discreet but constant way. It hurts when you see someone daring and realize you'd like to as well. It hurts when you feel like you're falling behind in your own life. It hurts when you think about the time that's passed and wonder if there's still time. And that pain, when not understood, can turn into self-sabotage again, because it's easier to create an external problem than to face an internal conflict. But there's something profoundly liberating in realizing that you are not your enemy. You're not against yourself. You're divided between protection and expansion, between the past that taught you to survive and the present that invites you to live. And that division isn't a flaw. It's a process. It's maturity under construction. Perhaps today isn't the day to change everything. Perhaps it's not the day for radical decisions, but it can be the day to see with honesty, to admit that a pattern exists, to recognize that it has a history, to accept that it once made sense, and to begin, little by little, to question whether it still needs to command your choices. Because when you start looking at yourself with that mix of firmness and compassion, something transforms. You no longer attack yourself for repeating. You investigate. You no longer call yourself weak. You ask what it's trying to protect, and that question creates space. Space for maturity, space for responsibility, space for a new relationship with yourself. Self-sabotage loses strength when you stop fighting it with hatred and start illuminating it with awareness. And awareness, even if it brings discomfort at first, always carries with it the possibility of freedom, not an euphoric freedom, but a lucid one. The freedom to realize that you can grow without abandoning yourself, that you can evolve without destroying yourself, that you can expand without betraying yourself. And perhaps that's what's beginning now. Not a visible change to the world, but a silent reorganization inside, an honest recognition that you no longer want to merely survive. You want to live with more presence, with more truth, with more wholeness, and that desire, when assumed with maturity, is already the first step toward interrupting the pattern that for so long seemed invisible. Too much stability can be fear in disguise. Over the years, stability begins to look like a synonym for maturity. You build a career, organize your finances, maintain stable relationships, fulfill responsibilities. From the outside, everything looks solid. And maybe it really is, but at some quiet point in your story, something started to lose color. Not dramatically, not like a collapse, just a light and persistent feeling of emptying, as if you were safe, but not alive. Confusing safety with paralysis is one of the most subtle patterns of self-sabotage. Because no one criticizes someone who is responsible, no one questions someone who keeps everything running. On the contrary, you are praised, you are respected, you are seen as an example, and that makes it even harder to admit that deep inside something is restless. There is a profound difference between being at peace and being complacent. Peace expands, complacency contracts. And the body knows the difference even when the mind tries to ignore it. The identity built around roles can be too comfortable. You become the competent professional, the present father, the strong mother, the reliable partner, the child who never causes trouble. And over time, the role begins to replace the person. You no longer ask yourself what you want. You only ask what is expected. You no longer think about what makes sense. You think about what is appropriate. And this exchange happens so slowly that it's almost imperceptible. When you notice, you're already living a version of yourself that functions but doesn't pulse. Your inner language reveals a lot. How many times do you say, "I can't," when, deep down, the more honest sentence would be, "I'm afraid. I can't change careers. I can't start something new. I can't slow down. I can't disappoint. I can't take risks." These sentences sound rational, responsible, adult. But if you listen more closely, you might find fear behind them. Fear of losing stability, fear of losing recognition, fear of discovering that perhaps there is still something bigger waiting for you. Think of someone 50 years old or more. Solid career, earned respect, organized life, and yet a constant feeling of emptiness. It's not ingratitude. It's not drama. It's the perception that life has become too predictable. Days repeat themselves. Conversations repeat themselves, responsibilities repeat themselves, and vitality, little by little, diminishes. There is no tragedy, there is monotony, and prolonged monotony can erode the soul more efficiently than great crises. The invisible cost of this rigid stability is the slow erosion of vitality. You keep functioning, but with less enthusiasm. You keep delivering, but with less presence. You keep smiling, but with less sparkle in your eyes. And the most dangerous part is that this becomes normal. You get used to the mild fatigue, to the lack of enthusiasm, to the feeling that that's just how it is. Except it's not just how it is. It's a pattern, and patterns can be questioned. Carl Jung spoke about the persona, that social mask necessary for living in society. The problem arises when you identify so much with the persona that you forget who you are behind it, when the role becomes a prison, when the image becomes an obligation, and then any desire for change feels like a threat. Because changing means disturbing the structure that sustains your current identity, and disturbing identity is frightening. Here, self-sabotage doesn't appear as an obvious mistake. It appears as immobility disguised as prudence, as permanence disguised as loyalty, as stability disguised as maturity. You don't destroy your life, you simply avoid expanding it, and that avoidance, repeated over the years, creates a deep sense that something was left behind, as if a part of you stopped in time while the rest kept moving forward. There is a silent irritation that betrays this, a mild discomfort when someone talks about fresh starts, an unease when you hear stories of people who changed late in life, a mixture of admiration and envy, and soon after comes the justification. For me, it's too late. That sentence weighs. It weighs on the chest, because deep down, you know that maybe it isn't too late. Maybe what exists is fear. Fear of abandoning an identity that was built with so much effort. Nietzsche spoke of the courage to become who you are, and becoming implies movement, implies deconstruction, implies leaving the old form to assume a new one. But when stability turns into a rigid comfort zone, any movement feels like a threat, and so you remain. You remain where you are recognized. You remain where it's safe. You remain where it's predictable, even if, inside, a part of you is begging for air. Stability is valuable, but when it prevents growth, it stops being a foundation and becomes a limit. And recognizing this doesn't mean throwing everything away. It means noticing where you are confusing safety with fear, where you are saying you can't, when in truth you are afraid, where you are maintaining a structure that no longer contains the person you are becoming. This perception can hurt because it reveals responsibility. It reveals that perhaps you are not trapped by circumstances, but by the inner narrative you built about them. And assuming that responsibility is uncomfortable, but it is also liberating, because the moment you realize that stability can be fear in disguise, you begin to recover a small portion of choice. And choice, even a small one, is already movement. 2.2. The emotional addiction to being needed. There is a type of self-sabotage that gets applauded. It receives praise. It receives recognition. It receives admiration. It is the habit of being indispensable, of always being available, of solving things before anyone asks, of holding everything together so nothing falls apart. From the outside, this looks like strength. From the inside, it can be fear. Self-esteem based on utility is a silent construction. You start to feel valuable when you are needed. When you help others, you feel alive. When no one needs you, a strange emptiness arises, a feeling of invisibility, so you anticipate. You take on extra responsibilities. You absorb problems that aren't yours. Not because someone demanded it, but because deep down, being needed provides security. It provides identity. It provides a place. Perhaps this began early. Perhaps you learned that love came hand in hand with performance, that being good meant not bothering anyone, that being strong meant not needing anyone. So you became competent, useful, reliable. And this version of you worked. It worked so well that it became your identity. But when identity is based solely on function, any moment of rest can feel like a threat. The chronic difficulty of saying no is not simply a lack of boundaries. Often it is fear of losing connection, fear of disappointing, fear of being seen as selfish. You feel the tension in your body when you think about refusing something. Your chest tightens. Your mind creates justifications for accepting, and you accept, even when tired, even when overwhelmed, even when you crave silence. And each yes that contradicts your truth leaves a small internal mark. The resentment accumulated from excess responsibility doesn't arise all at once. It builds slowly, in small frustrations, in poorly slept nights, in tasks taken on without desire. You help, but you start to feel used. You solve, but you start to feel invisible. And then something inside you hardens. Because no one can sustain everything forever without paying an emotional price. There is also the silent fear of becoming irrelevant, especially when life changes, when children grow up, when roles transform, when work ceases to be the center. If your identity has always been tied to being needed, any change feels like a direct threat to your worth. So you stay busy. You solve everyone's problems. You get involved in conflicts you don't need to enter. You remain indispensable to avoid facing the emptiness that emerges when no one needs you. The self-sabotage here is subtle, solving others' problems to avoid facing your own. While you're busy with other people's crises, you don't have to look at your forgotten desires. While you're sustaining everyone, you don't have to ask what you want to sustain in yourself. Utility becomes distraction. Responsibility becomes escape. And in the midst of it, your own conflicts remain untouched. Carl Jung spoke about the shadow, the parts of us that we do not recognize or integrate. Sometimes behind the tireless caregiver, there is a tired, frustrated part that desires to be cared for. But admitting this feels like weakness, so you repress it. And what is repressed does not disappear. It manifests as irritation, as self-criticism, as small acts of sabotage. You forget important commitments. You postpone your own decisions. You create tension where it wasn't needed, as if a part of you were trying to say, I exist too. Nietzsche spoke about affirming one's own life, and affirming one's own life includes affirming your limits, your desires, your individuality. When you live only to be needed, your own expansion takes a backseat, and repressed expansion turns into internal tension. This tension can transform into self-sabotage because, unconsciously, you begin to fail precisely when you need to take care of yourself. It's as if there were an internal resistance to your own growth. Being needed is not wrong. Caring is not wrong. Taking on responsibilities is not wrong. The problem arises when this becomes the only way to feel valuable, when you can no longer see yourself beyond the function, when silence feels too empty, when rest feels like guilt, when the simple act of prioritizing yourself generates anxiety. There is a silent maturity in noticing this without condemning yourself, in recognizing that you learned to exist by being useful, that it made sense, that it was a survival strategy, but also in admitting that perhaps now is the time to broaden that identity, to allow yourself to be loved without performance, to allow yourself to be seen without solving something. Because as long as your worth depends exclusively on your utility, any pause will seem like a threat. And as long as pause seems like a threat, you will continue creating excessive movement to avoid the encounter with yourself. And perhaps true growth begins when you discover that you can be important without being indispensable, that you can be loved without being exhausted, that you can exist without constantly proving something. Sophisticated procrastination, preserving the self-image. There is a type of delay that feels intelligent. You don't put things off because you're irresponsible. You delay because you want to do it better, because you want to be more prepared, because you want everything to be aligned. And while you organize, plan, structure, something inside you feels like you're being prudent, but sometimes that prudence is just fear dressed up well. Excessive planning can become an elegant form of escape. You study a little more, research a little more, adjust one more detail, and that gives the sensation of progress. Except real progress requires exposure. It requires showing something that's still imperfect. It requires risking not living up to your own expectations, and that's the part that hurts. Not the work itself. It's the vulnerability of being seen trying. Perfectionism, more often than not, is not love for excellence. It's defense against judgment. While something exists only in your head, it is grand, it is promising, it is potential. But the moment you put it into the world, it stops being fantasy and becomes concrete. And the concrete can be criticized, it can be ignored, it can be insufficient. So you keep it in the realm of ideas, because in the realm of ideas, you are still extraordinary. There is also the fantasy of a potential greater than actual execution. As long as you don't try, you can believe you would be incredible if you did. The dream remains intact, and that preserves your identity. It preserves the image you have of yourself. But there is a silent price in that preservation. The price is time. Years pass. The desire remains there, and the distance between who you are and who you imagine you could be begins to hurt. The hidden fear here is discovering your concrete limits, discovering that perhaps you are not as exceptional as you imagined, or perhaps discovering that you are capable of much more than you believed, and that this will demand greater responsibility. Both possibilities frighten you, because both require change, and change displaces identity. Sigmund Freud spoke of defense mechanisms that protect the ego from psychic pain. Sophisticated procrastination can function this way. It protects you from frustration, but it also protects you from fulfillment. It avoids failure, but it also avoids success. And in the midst of this illusory balance, your life remains suspended. It doesn't collapse, but it doesn't move forward either. The result is years of postponement disguised as prudence. You say it's not the right time yet, that you need more stability, that you need to resolve other things first. And perhaps some of those reasons are legitimate, but if you listen honestly, you may notice there is a pattern. There is always something before. There is always a condition to be met. There is always one more detail to adjust. And while you wait for the ideal scenario, time keeps passing. The body ages. Opportunities change, circumstances transform, and that project, that decision, that important conversation keeps being pushed into an indefinite future, a future that never arrives because it depends on an absolute security that does not exist. Nietzsche spoke of the courage to become who you are, and becoming requires imperfect action. It requires entering the experience without guarantees. It requires accepting that your identity will not be protected all the time. When you understand this, you begin to realize that the fear is not of failure. It's of exposure. It's of the responsibility that comes after you prove to yourself that that you are capable. There is a tension in the body when you know you need to start, a slight discomfort, a restlessness. You feel it, but you try to distract yourself. You occupy yourself with smaller tasks. You resolve urgent but unimportant matters. And at the end of the day, you feel a strange fatigue. A fatigue that doesn't come from physical effort, but from the mental energy spent avoiding what really matters. The self-sabotage here doesn't shout. It whispers. It says it's not the time yet, that it's better to wait, that perhaps tomorrow you'll be more prepared. And so, little by little, you keep intact the image of who you could be, while avoiding actually becoming that person. Recognizing this is not accusing yourself. It is freeing yourself from the illusion. Because when you admit that the delay may be fear, something changes. You begin to see that you don't need to be completely ready to start. You just need to be willing to tolerate the discomfort of imperfection, and that willingness, even if small, already weakens the pattern that for so long seemed invisible. 2.4. Emotional repetition, choosing the familiar, not the healthy. There is a silent force that pulls us toward what we already know, even when what we know hurts us. You can promise yourself that this time it will be different. You can swear you won't accept certain behaviors anymore. You can tell yourself that you've learned, and yet, before you realize it, you're once again facing the same type of person, the same dynamic, the same pain. It's not coincidence, it's familiarity. The attraction to patterns that confirm old wounds is not irrational. It is predictable. The brain prefers the known to the unknown, even when the known is uncomfortable. Because the known offers an illusion of control. You already know how that story ends. You already know what the signs are. You already know how to react. The healthy, on the other hand, can feel strange, too quiet, too calm, and silence can frighten someone who has learned to associate intensity with love. Confusing intensity with connection is one of the deepest mistakes. Turbulent relationships produce adrenaline. They produce urgency. They produce drama. And the body, accustomed to that rhythm, interprets that activation as passion. But activation is not necessarily bonding. Often it is simply the repetition of an old pattern, etched in moments of deprivation, rejection, or insecurity. And what is repeated many times begins to feel like destiny. The attachment to dynamics that reinforce low self-esteem also has an internal logic. If you grew up feeling that you had to prove your worth, you may feel strangeness when someone accepts you without demands. If you're used to fighting for attention, you may distrust it when it comes easily, because what confirms your wound feels consistent with the story you've told yourself about who you are, whereas what contradicts that story demands internal reconstruction. And reconstructing identity is hard work. There is also discomfort when you encounter real stability. Healthy relationships don't provoke the same constant emotional peaks. They bring security, predictability, dialogue, and for someone who has lived in tension for a long time, the absence of tension can feel like the absence of love. Silence can feel like indifference. Calmness can feel like boredom. And then restlessness arises, an inexplicable urge to create movement, to provoke conflict, to test boundaries. In this case, self-sabotage can appear as abandoning what is stable because it seems lacking emotion. You find something that works, something that respects your limits, something that offers presence, and still, something inside you starts looking for flaws. Small defects are magnified. Small differences become major incompatibilities, and before you know it, you're once again choosing what activates your anxiety instead of what sustains your peace. Freud spoke of the repetition compulsion, that unconscious impulse to relive old experiences in an attempt, perhaps, to finally master them. But repetition doesn't heal. Repetition reinforces, and as long as the pattern remains unconscious, it continues to guide choices. Jung would add that what we do not integrate within ourselves manifests externally as fate. You believe you're choosing different people, but deep down, you're choosing the same dynamic with different faces. There is a part of you that feels at home in known chaos, and there is another part that desires stability but doesn't know how to inhabit it, because stability demands a different kind of vulnerability. It demands trusting without drama. It demands staying without explosions. It demands building gradually without peaks, and that can be challenging for someone who learned that love must be earned through suffering. Recognizing this pattern is not about condemning your past choices. It's about understanding them. They made sense within your story, but perhaps now you are in a different moment. Perhaps your emotional maturity is asking for something quieter, more conscious, more whole, and that may feel strange at first. It may feel less intense, but intensity is not synonymous with depth. Emotional repetition weakens when you begin to distinguish what is familiar from what is healthy, when you realize that immediate comfort does not always mean growth, when you understand that peace may feel strange in the beginning, but it is not a threat, and little by little, you learn to tolerate silence, stability, predictability as signs of safety, not emptiness. Interrupting this pattern does not require dramatic decisions. It requires lucidity. It requires noticing when you are being pulled by the familiarity of the wound. It requires choosing, even with discomfort, what sustains your dignity, and that choice, repeated over time, begins to rewrite the narrative that once seemed inevitable. There is a curious moment in life when, after much effort, things start to align. A project moves forward, a relationship stabilizes, recognition arrives, and instead of pure joy, an unexpected tension emerges, a subtle tightness in the chest, a hard-to-explain restlessness, as if success carried with it an invisible threat. Success activates the fear of exposure. When you grow, you become more visible. When you stand out, you step out of the shadows. And stepping out of the shadows means being seen. Being seen means being evaluated, judged, observed. And if, at some point in your history, visibility meant criticism or rejection, your emotional system may associate growth with danger. So, unconsciously, you begin to dim your own light, to delay decisions, to create small conflicts that return you to more familiar territory. Growth demands greater responsibility, not just external responsibility but internal. If you succeed, if you prove to yourself that you are capable, you can no longer use the excuse of incapacity, and that weighs heavily, because assuming your own power also means assuming its consequences. It means accepting that your life can be larger than you imagined, and we are not always prepared to sustain that expansion. There is also an unconscious belief that it won't last. Perhaps because in the past, good moments were abruptly interrupted. Perhaps because you learned not to trust stability. So when something starts to go well, a part of you already prepares for the fall. And sometimes, to avoid being caught off guard, you provoke the fall yourself. You create tension where there was harmony. You over-question where there was trust. You subtly sabotage what was beginning to flourish. Creating small conflicts to restore the old pattern may seem irrational, but it has an internal logic. The old pattern is known. It may be limiting, but it is predictable. The new pattern of growth, recognition, stability requires a different kind of posture. It requires that you stay, that you sustain, that you don't run away. And remaining in something good can be more challenging than leaving something bad. Viktor Frankl spoke of responsibility as a response to life. When life expands, responsibility expands too. And that expansion can frighten, because it is not just about conquering something. It is about sustaining what has been conquered, about continuing to show up, about remaining committed, about not retreating when fear arises. An uncomfortable question emerges at this point. Can you bear to sustain what you desire? Not just achieve it, but sustain it. Not just dream it, but remain in it. Sustaining demands emotional maturity. It demands tolerating exposure. It demands dealing with your own greatness without fleeing into self-sabotage that restores the feeling of control. Perhaps you recognize this pattern in small behaviors, a deliberate delay, an impulsive decision that creates unnecessary tension, an exaggerated doubt that paralyzes progress. Nothing too dramatic, just enough to interrupt the positive flow, and soon afterward, a strange sense of relief, because returning to the old pattern brings familiarity, brings predictability, even if it also brings limitation. Nietzsche spoke of becoming who you are as a process that requires crossing the discomfort of your own expansion. It is not just about fighting external difficulties. It is about dealing with the internal fear of being larger than the old version of yourself. The shadow is comfortable because it is known. The light demands adaptation, and adaptation demands courage. The discomfort when things start to go right does not mean you don't deserve it. It does not mean you are not capable. It simply means your identity is being updated, and every update generates temporary instability. If you interpret that instability as a sign of danger, you retreat. If you interpret it as a sign of growth, you remain. Self-sabotage loses strength when you learn to stay in the success, to stay in the stability, to stay in the recognition, to stay in healthy love, to stay even when the impulse to flee arises. And that staying is not passivity, it is maturity. It is the conscious choice not to restore the old pattern just because it is more comfortable. Perhaps the real challenge is not conquering something new. Perhaps it is sustaining the new without returning to the old. And that sustaining begins when you recognize that the fear is not proof of incapacity. It is simply the signal that you are crossing an old boundary. And crossing old boundaries is exactly what allows a new version of you to become real. Leaving the cave requires courage to lose the shadows. Plato described the cave as a place where people mistake shadows for reality. The shadows are familiar, they are predictable, they are known. Even though limited, they offer security. Leaving the cave is not just walking toward the light. It is accepting that what seemed true may have been nothing more than habit, and that hurts. Because abandoning shadows means abandoning old certainties. Self-sabotage is attachment to the predictable, not necessarily to suffering, but to what is known, to the pattern you already know how it ends, to the dynamic you already understand, to the role you already know how to play. The predictable may be narrow, but it is comfortable. It does not require you to redefine who you are. It does not require you to lose old references. It does not require you to face the discomfort of expansion. The shadow is comfortable because it demands no transformation. Remaining small requires no internal reconstruction. Repeating patterns requires no new emotional skills. Staying in the old version of yourself requires no confrontation with deeper fears. Growing, on the other hand, displaces everything. Growing demands that you abandon justifications. It demands that you assume responsibility. It demands that you sustain your own power without hiding behind self-protection. Growing hurts because it displaces identity, and identity is not something superficial. It is the narrative you have built about yourself over the years. It is the way others recognize you. It is the place you occupy in the world. When that identity begins to expand, a natural instability arises. It is like shedding skin. The old one no longer fits, but the new one is still sensitive, and in that interval, the temptation to return to what is known is enormous. Maturity is tolerating the discomfort of the light. It does not mean the absence of fear. It means remaining even with fear present. It means recognizing the impulse to sabotage and choosing not to follow it automatically. It means noticing when you are recreating the old pattern and interrupting that movement, even if only a little. You do not need to transform everything at once. You do not need to break with your entire history. Real change is gradual. It is conscious. It is responsible. Perhaps the most honest invitation is simple. Identify a pattern you have repeated for years and interrupt it by 5% this week, not 100%. Not radically, just 5%. A small no where you always said yes. A small step where you always postponed. A small staying where you always fled. Those 5% may seem insignificant, but they are not, because they break the illusion of inevitability. They show that the pattern is not destiny, that self-sabotage is not identity, that you can choose differently even on a minimal scale. And minimal choices repeated build new internal structures. Perhaps you still feel fear. Perhaps you still feel resistance. That does not mean you are on the wrong path. It simply means you are moving beyond old territory. And every movement beyond the known generates tension. The difference now is that you can recognize that tension as a sign of growth, not of incapacity. Leaving the cave is not a single heroic act. It is a continuous process of lucidity, of noticing when you are defending yourself from your own growth, of welcoming fear without submitting to it, of assuming responsibility for your own expansion with firmness and compassion. You are not broken, you are in transition, and transitions are uncomfortable, but they are also portals. Portals to a life less automatic, less repetitive, more conscious. A life where you no longer need to sabotage yourself to feel safe. A life where security and growth can coexist. Perhaps the light stings at first, but it is in that light that you begin to see yourself whole,